All right. Well, good afternoon. Thank you and welcome for coming to this event entitled Not in Our Name, Jewish Solidarity with Palestine, an Intersectional Feminist Perspective. My name is Brenny Mendoza. I'm the chair of the Department of Gender and Women's Studies and the director of the new Institute Institute for Feminist Studies and Social Action, or IFSA for short, also co-directed by Dr. Tina Bayen. We are co-sponsors of this event along with Queer Studies, Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies programs, Civil Discourse and Social Change, and the Department of Community Education Studies. Together, we are proud to open or be the space, and in fact be a sanctuary where we, the CSUN community, can carry out open dialogues and exchange ideas and sentiments about the most pressing issues of our time. IFSA was founded with this intention of creating a series of instances like this one, where we as a community of thinkers can reflect on the multiple crises that deeply affect us, such as the crisis of democracy and the resurfacing of fascism, the destructive forces of capitalism and the climate catastrophe that it is causing, and the permanent wars, especially those that the US is constantly engaging, like the present one in Israel, that not only cost millions of lives in the battleground abroad, but also here at home, where the basic needs of the population are left unattended. This is then one of a series of events that we hope will be organizing in the coming days, months, and years. And we are very happy to start this work with someone from such a courageous organization like the Jewish Voice for Peace. At this very moment in time, the world is witnessing in horror and in disbelief one of the most brutal military assaults against a civilian population since World War II. I'm referring, of course, to the military operation that Israel is carrying out against Gaza after Hamas attack on October 7th, which cost the lives of 1,400 Israelis, civilians and soldiers, and where more than 200 persons were taken hostage. It was a violent and desperate attempt to call attention to the plight of the Palestinians who have been living under siege for more than 7 decades. We mourn the lives lost in this attack. But since October 7th, more than 10,000 unarmed and non-combatant Palestinians, nearly half of them children and women, have been killed in a period of 1 month under heavy Israeli air bombardment and now under a ground invasion that not even the recent wars of the US against Iraq and Afghanistan or the proxy war in Ukraine could surpass in that short period of time. Food, water, electricity, and fuel have been cut off for 2.3 million people. It is for many of us extremely difficult to wrap around our heads and hearts the enormity of the human suffering that a defenseless civilian population like the Gazans are experiencing today. To be sure, the predicament of Palestinians is and should be impossible for any one of us to ignore, as is the loss of innocent Israeli lives, and thus we must demand vehemently for an immediate end of this assault, an immediate ceasefire. So to help us begin to understand the tragedy of the Palestinians and the Jewish people, who both deserve so much better, we have invited Dr. Penny Rosenwasser to talk about her work on anti-Semitism and anti-Arabism from a feminist perspective. But before I introduce Penny, Dr. Shina Malhotra would read the CSUN student code that gives us the guidelines of how to approach such delicate matters.
Hi everyone, I'm Shina Malhotra and I'll be serving as your moderator along with Dr. Catherine Sorrells. Before we proceed with the talk, I want to read a small bit from our CSUN values, which are part of the mission statement of our university. This is the part entitled Respect for All People. We aspire to behave as an inclusive, cooperative community Our behaviors, policies, and programs affirm the worth and personal dignity of every member of the university community and contribute to a campus climate of civility, collegiality, tolerance, and reasoned debate. Grounds for student discipline. There are a couple of pieces I want to read. The first is willful, material, and substantial disruption or obstruction of a university-related event or any on-campus activity. And 2, conduct that threatens or endangers the health or safety of any person within or related to the university community, including physical abuse, threats, intimidation, harassment, or sexual misconduct. So I'm just reading those as a quick reminder for the conduct we are expecting at this event, but really I invite you all to participate in a respectful way and with an open mind, as it was really a privilege to have this space together. So now let me just go over the flow of the event. After our speaker completes her talk, we will be holding a Q&A session. You've all received index cards, and there are volunteers with more if you need them when you came in. So please write down questions if you want to ask the speaker questions, and later there will be ushers who will be collecting those questions for us. With that, I turn it back to Brenny to introduce our speaker.
So thank you, Sheena, and I'm really honored to introduce to you Dr. Penny Rosenwasser. She's a white, queer, Ashkenazi Jewish educator and intersectional feminist peace activist. Her most recent award-winning book is Hope into Practice, Jewish Women Choosing Justice Despite Our Fears, which I think is there. Yeah. So Penny co-teaches an anti-Semitism and anti-Arabism class with a Palestinian colleague at the City College of San Francisco, showing us with her life and teaching practices that peaceful conviviality is not only possible, but the only way to be human, ein Mensch. Penny chaired the Jewish caucus of the National Women's Studies Association, where she is a member of Feminist for Justice in Palestine. She's also a founding board member of Jewish Voice for Peace and helps lead racial justice work at the Kehillah Community Synagogue in Oakland. Please help me welcome Dr. Penny Rosenwasser to CSUN.
Hey everybody, thank you for being here. Thank you, Brenny. Thank you, Sheena. Thank you, Hanum. Where are you? Thank you. This is my book, Hope into Practice, Jewish Women Choosing Justice Despite Our Fears, a lot about Israel-Palestine. And I use the pronouns she, her. I want to honor and thank the Northridge Sesi Vitam people, the first people of this territory, and the Sesi Vitamari people who are still here, whose land we're on, who stewarded this beautiful land for centuries. And I ask that I may always learn how to be a good guest and a better guest. Thank you all for bringing me. This talk, as you can see, is not in my name, Jewish Solidarity with Palestine, an intersectional feminist perspective. Thank you all so much for coming today. It really helps my heart. Really appreciate it. So I want to frame everything that I'm going to be talking about with something from Jewish liturgy that calls to me very deeply right now. Did I thank you, Sheena? Okay. My dear longtime friend and colleague, Sheena Malhotra, who this would not be happening without her courage and brilliance. So thank you, Sheena. So I want to frame everything I'm going to be talking about with something from Jewish liturgy that calls to me deeply right now. Choose life that you and your children shall live. Choose life that you and your children shall live. Let's grieve the lives of all those already lost in Palestine and Israel and remain committed to a future where every life is precious and all people live in freedom and safety. And welcome everyone who's just coming in. I don't know if there's any chairs There's a few seats up front if somebody wants them, or raise your hand if you have a seat. And there's more chairs coming. Thank you all. It's great to have this attendance. Thank you. This is from the Jewish Liberation Fund. We seek to remember our pain is not diminished by opening our hearts more fully to the heartbreak of another. It's only through a heart cracked open to suffering that we may begin to see one another as fully human, to begin to build a better future for all our people. In this moment, I want to invite us to face all the suffering and honor all the humanity of all those killed, the innocent young people killed at the music festival in Israel, the innocent families in the kibbutz, 1,400 people total, the innocent children, women, and men bombed as we speak in Gaza. So far as of last night, it was 10,500 dead. I'm sure it's more now. On my email signature are the words of Naomi Klein: "Side with the child over the gun every single time, no matter whose gun, no matter whose child." What's going on now in Palestine and Israel, Angela Davis is calling a global emergency, and in Gaza, it's a humanitarian catastrophe. And I'm assuming some of you will disagree with some of the things, all of the things I say, which is fine. We're in a university. We want to have critical thinking here. I'm just going to ask you to consider, how would it be if anything I said were true? Just to hold that and think about it. We know that this war is destroying lives and crushing spirits and re-traumatizing millions of people in ways that are going to take generations to heal and repair. And as our hearts break, we take action, calling for an immediate ceasefire and freeing the hostages. As of this morning, as I said, last I knew it was 10,500 Palestinians killed, 70% of them women and children, by the Israeli Defense Forces. One child killed every 10 minutes. 27,000 wounded. 1,400 Israelis have been killed, 5,000 wounded by Hamas's murderous assault, which shocked Israel to its core. 5 hostages have been released. We think 240 are still held captive. My Israeli feminist scholar colleague told me that 60% of the Israelis who were slaughtered were peace activists. In Gaza right now, the Israeli government is not allowing any fuel in. There's very little clean water or food. Often all communication is shut down, so there's no way to communicate with your loved ones. There's no electricity, so the bakeries can't bake bread. Desalination plants can't clean the water. 1/3 of the hospitals have been destroyed for a population of 2.3 million people. Doctors are operating on patients on the floor, using their cell phones for light, often without any anesthesia or morphine, because there's none left. And I imagine being on that hospital floor and someone operating on me without morphine or anesthesia. Both my feminist Arab and Israeli Jewish colleagues have said to me, this situation is all a result of Israel's military occupation of Palestine. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But in terms of the larger context, from 2008 to October 6, 2023, Palestinian deaths were 6,407. Israeli deaths were 308. I think that tells a story. So here's some brief, incomplete background to this current catastrophe. Jews were persecuted for 2,000 years, mostly in Christian Europe. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the pogroms being state-sponsored riots, which killed hundreds of thousands. And in fact, today is the anniversary of Kristallnacht, one of those very deadly pogroms in Nazi Germany. Then it was the Nazi Holocaust, 78 years ago, that systematically murdered 1 out of every 3 Jews in the world, 2 out of every 3 Jews in Europe. And it drove many terrified Jews to escape Europe to what's now called Israel and Palestine, because almost no other country would take Jews in, including the United States. The United States took a limited few. Soon after that, in 1948, it was armed Jewish militias who drove out over 750,000 Palestinians, confiscating their land and their homes, raping and killing some, and what is known as, in Arabic as the Nakba, the catastrophe. And this driving people off their land is what's called ethnic cleansing. So I wanted to show how European anti-Semitism is one root cause of the Israeli-Palestinian tragedy, and how the US bears responsibility as well, because again, the US wouldn't let in most Jews trying to escape Hitler. This content's absent in most mainstream media. Today, Palestinians deserve to be safe. Jewish Israelis deserve to be safe, and the safety of neither can come at the expense of the other. I was actually born 4 years to the day after the last death march left Auschwitz. And I've been to Palestine and Israel 7 times. I've led 4 women's peace delegations there, and I've stayed in Gaza up to a week each time that I was there. I've stayed in Palestinian homes and refugee camps in the West Bank and Gaza. And I've also stayed in Jewish Israeli homes in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Years ago, in Al-Amari refugee camp on the West Bank, I saw Israeli soldiers barging into homes, rounding up hundreds of Palestinian men and boys, holding them all day in a field, handcuffed under a blazing sun. I visited grieving parents whose children were just shot and killed by Israeli soldiers. In Rafah camp in Gaza, our host Ali showed us where 20 homes had been demolished by Israeli bulldozers, an area the size of a football field, leaving over 100 people without shelter in the night. In one of the houses left standing, where the wall of the children's bedroom bore fist-sized artillery holes like this, I met Dia, 2 years old with bright brown eyes, wearing pajamas with elephants on them. His mother told me he was so frightened from the constant shelling, he still didn't speak. He cried most of the time. Manal, 27, showed me around Gaza. She still had nightmares from being beaten by Israeli guards when she was a political prisoner. And when we parted, she slipped the bracelet off of her wrist. Pressing it into my hand, she whispered, "Please don't forget me." And I'm wearing that bracelet now. Also in Gaza, I saw scrawled on a Khan Yunis camp wall, "If you destroy our houses, you will not destroy our souls." In Gaza City, Ali introduced my group. These are Jews, and they're standing with us for peace. Before I went to Gaza the last time, I was staying in Israel with my working class lesbian friend Haya, who was a leader of the Israeli peace movement at that time. So before I left for Gaza, Haya pulled $50 out of her wallet and asked me to give it to someone in Gaza who needed it. She said, "For solidarity, not charity." And in Gaza, I remember staying in Jabalia refugee camp with different families, and I'm remembering Hadija and Jamal, 2 of the kids. I was teaching them astrology. Hadija told me she planned to become a doctor. And I remember how afraid everyone was outside when you would hear outside the Israeli soldiers. And I often wonder, are Hadija and Jamal still alive? Just last week, the Israeli army bombed Jabalia camp for 2 days, reported to be some of the most damaging bombing, creating huge craters in the ground. Reports said it felt like the end of the world. Hundreds killed, body parts everywhere. Children are traumatized. Oops, sorry. And I've also stayed in West Jerusalem with Haya and with another peace activist friend, Yvonne, and her family, where friends told me, don't stand at that bus stop. There were suicide bombings there. Or when the siren went off, and Yvonne and I would be worried because her kids were at the mall, and she would call them to make sure they were okay. After October, I saw the video of young Israelis running for their lives at the music festival. Their tents shot up. And I've heard the stories about parents talking to them on cell phones, and then nothing, a lost connection. And I think, how many times have I camped at music festivals? I hear the heart-rending interviews of those whose parents or children were savagely attacked at the kibbutz, where Hamas went from one house to another, murdering women, children, babies, the elderly. This is from Israeli writer Noam Schuster. Every moment, I get another message about another person I knew who is gone. The scale of the violence that hit us was nothing like anything we had experienced before. Many of them are people who stood beside us in the peace and justice community, actively resisting occupation. I'm so proud of my friends who, despite losing family members in the Hamas attack, did not lose their moral compass, who say, do not use this pain for revenge or to inflict more pain. That's not the solution. And the sad truth is that in the name of this pain, our government is carrying out atrocities on people who had nothing to do with it. Chaim Katzman was an Israeli peace activist killed by Hamas in the village of Holit. He used his body to shield 3 of his neighbors, saving their lives. Chaim got his PhD at the University of Washington and was a congregant at Kadima Synagogue in Seattle, where my friend Rabbi David Basier is the rabbi. Chaim's sibling, Noy Katzman, said, "My call to my government, stop killing people. What Israel's doing now is just revenge, not for the security of anyone." Mayotz Inon talked about his 78-year-old father and 75-year-old mother who were massacred by Hamas. He wrote, "I'm crying for my parents, I'm crying for my friends, I'm crying for those who were kidnapped, I'm crying for the victims on the Palestinian side, and I'm crying for all the victims that are going to suffer. We don't sleep at night, we don't eat, we're just broken. But from these traumatized days, we must learn the lessons from history to break the pattern of escalating violence that feeds hatred and creates orphans." Ofer Kassis is an Israeli Jewish Knesset member. Knesset is the government of Israel, like our Congress. Ofer said, "Absolutely nothing can justify or legitimize the carnage that Hamas carried out in the towns, kibbutzim, and villages in the southern part of Israel. Nothing can justify it. At the same time, absolutely nothing can justify the massacre that the Israelis are carrying out now in Gaza, not even the crimes of Hamas." Ofer went on, "I got a WhatsApp message from a very good friend of mine who was hiding with her husband in the kibbutz. And she told me she was very afraid and she could hear the Hamas fighters outside. Unfortunately, those were probably the last words she ever wrote because she was murdered with her husband just after she sent me that message. She was against the occupation. It's innocent civilians on both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, pay the price of the occupation that Israel refuses to end." So I'm not trying to measure pain here. All of it is horrible. And these situations are not symmetrical. One of them is a military occupation of another people. There is a power difference. So what is the Israeli occupation? Well, it's a military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, where Palestinians are allowed to live, where the Israeli government has control over Palestinian lives, where Palestinians are not allowed the same rights that Israelis have, and that's why it's called apartheid. It's a system of discrimination and segregation, very much like Jim Crow was in this country. Under occupation, Israeli soldiers demolish Palestinian homes, destroy Palestinian crops and olive trees, arrest, torture, and kill children, kill parents in front of their children, control Palestinian access to clean water, make it very difficult to travel from one place to another. Amira Haas is an Israeli journalist for the Israeli paper Haaretz. Haaretz is considered the New York Times of Israel. And Amira has lived in both the West Bank and Gaza, and her parents survived Auschwitz. Amira wrote, "In a few days, Israelis went through what Palestinians have experienced for decades: military attacks, death, cruelty, slain children, bodies piled up on the road, siege, fear, anxiety over loved ones, captivity, being targets of vengeance, destruction of buildings, ruined celebrations, helplessness in the face of all-powerful armed men, and searing humiliation. For days on TV, we heard about and still mostly hear about the Hamas attacks on Israeli civilians, which are war crimes, without any acknowledgement that a lot of this behavior has been happening to Palestinians all these years. I saw on MSNBC this heartbreaking story of an Israeli Jewish mother who's trying to find out if her daughter Adi, who was at the music festival, is dead or captive in Gaza. And this mother kept asking how human beings could do this to one another. And seeing her pain, I could feel my own tears. And it made me wonder, she seems like such a compassionate person. Does she not know how IDF soldiers, IDF is the Israeli Defense Forces, doesn't she know how IDF soldiers have shot and killed innocent Palestinian children for decades? It brings up for me whose lives are considered precious, whose lives are valued. Queer Jewish philosopher Judith Butler calls this the grievability factor. Whose suffering gets talked about and gets attention? My friend Anna Baltzer is also a Jewish activist, and Anna wrote, "My question is, if you were more shaken by the Israeli lives lost in one day than 75 years of killing and kidnapping Palestinians, why is that?" The head of UNICEF said, "Gaza has become a graveyard for children." Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said he wants to blow Gaza to rubble, to bomb Gaza to rubble, And they're using white phosphorus bombs, which melt flesh to the bone. Palestinians in Gaza haven't had any sleep for more than 2 to 3 hours a night because of the nonstop bombing. Palestinian journalists report they've never experienced such mass destruction. IDF, that's the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF official Daniel Hagari said, "The emphasis of the bombing is on damage, not on accuracy." People's homes have been destroyed. They're living in tents and sleeping in shifts because there isn't room for everyone to sleep in the tent at one time. And there's no place in Gaza to hide. When Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant announced he was cutting off fuel, food, water, and electricity to Gaza, this amounts to collective punishment against everyone in Gaza, the vast majority of whom are not Hamas fighters. Many around the world, and more every day, including the UN Secretary General, are calling for a ceasefire, saying the appalling Hamas attacks cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. When hospitals don't have electricity, what happens to newborns in incubators, people on dialysis, elderly patients on oxygen? The New York Times reported that since there's no more iodine or clean water, there are maggots crawling on people's wounds. People are forced to drink polluted, brackish water. Women forced to give birth in the street because there's no place else to go. People are breaking into UN warehouses, desperate for food to feed their children. I'm just going to breathe for a minute here because this is really painful. Last I heard, there were only 2 bakeries still able to function to sell bread for 2.3 million people. The rest of the bakeries were bombed. Kamal Abu Al-Fahem said, "I stood in the bakery line for 5 hours, terrified, hearing bombing all around me. I managed to buy a bag of 30 to 40 small pitas. I came home exhausted." Saeed Nasser said, "When the hunger gets intolerable, we ask our neighbors for food. If we eat breakfast, we don't eat for the rest of the day." Mohammed Abu Rukba has had to relocate his family 4 times, moving from house to house, searching for somewhere safe. His children are so terrified, they can't walk. His eldest son, 14-year-old Ahmed, said he couldn't feel his left foot and had pain in his back. His youngest son, 10, Zaid, couldn't stop crying. This is not just a war on Hamas. This is a war against Palestinian people, mostly civilians, over half of whom are children. Israeli human rights lawyer Michael Safard said, "Most people I know in Gaza are uploading their wills and last words to their social media accounts. They're writing their children's name on their bodies, so if they're killed, people will know who they are." So we have to hold several truths simultaneously, and it's really okay to let our hearts break for all of it. The crimes committed by Hamas were an unconscionable massacre, and the revenge that Israel is inflicting on all of Gaza is genocide. A leader from the Jewish activist group If Not Now said, "The word genocide might sound extreme, but this moment is extreme." And no, this is not the same scale of genocide that was committed against Jews by the Nazis. The Center for Constitutional Rights is calling this a genocide because the relentless bombing of Gaza is a systematic undercutting of the livelihood, health, well-being, and capacity to persist of Gazans. Under international law, genocide requires two things: an intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, and then the attempted destruction of that group. UN official Craig McIver just resigned because he says the UN is failing to stop the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, which he called a textbook case of genocide, including that Israeli officials have publicly stated their intention not to distinguish between civilians and combatants. One Gazan wrote, "We wake up in the morning and count our children, reassure our friends that we're still alive." And this from Susan Hamad. "We lost over 40 members of my extended family while huddled into one apartment in Jabalia camp. The youngest, a baby named Yemen, was only 3 weeks old. Yemen's mother, an engineer, was breastfeeding him when the house was bombed by an Israeli warplane, and they were both killed. We found Yemen on her chest, suckling milk. Yemen's father survived, but stopped speaking." Wafa is a former colleague of mine. We used to be on Zoom calls together at work. When our colleague Ziad called her, she told Ziad, "Being together, even so crowded, we feel warm and we care about and support each other. We hug the children and we keep them close to us. When the children play, they get a few minutes to forget what's happening around them until the next shelling, when they run back to their parents, overwhelmed with fear." There are hundreds of people who are under the rubble. This is still Wafa speaking. "This is what could happen to us at any moment. The psychological impact is unbearable. It's a continuous massacre. Hour by hour, we hear about entire families who are erased. Our brains cannot absorb it. When we sleep, we try to choose the places that might give us a chance to survive if the house is bombed. We think about it all the time. When children sleep, we try to put them in the corners because maybe this will give them the best possible chance." The Israeli government says they're doing this to ensure Jewish safety, but genocide will not keep Jews safe. What will allow Israelis to be safe is to work with Palestinians to create conditions together where both people have equal rights, safety, justice, and the opportunity to thrive. This includes an end to structural inequality and domination, an end to the occupation, an end to the siege of Gaza. I wanted to say something here about safety and fear and historical trauma. Everyone wants to feel safe, right? And many Jews around the world have historical trauma that's been passed down to us from thousands of years of persecution, from way before the Holocaust. And Palestinians also have historical trauma, especially from violence since 1948. A professor from the University of Pennsylvania said the Nakba permeates the psychology of Palestinians, just like the Holocaust permeates the psychology of Jews. I think that's really important. So everything happening now is activating all that fear. So many of us are not just feeling the fear right now, but the accumulation of fear over many, many years. And when our trauma is activated, the way our brains work is that we literally stop thinking and go into fight or flight or freeze mode, into reaction and panic. Every violent attack on Jews can activate the fear. Oh my God, the Holocaust is coming again. Orthodox Jew and journalist Peter Beinart said, "This attack has awakened the deepest traumas of our badly scarred Jewish people. But the truth remains. The denial of Palestinian freedom sits at the heart of this conflict." And that's why my colleague, Irina Klepvich, a lesbian Jewish professor at Barnard who teaches women's studies in Yiddish. Irina escaped the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland when she was 4 years old with her mother. Her father was a leader of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. If you don't know about that uprising during World War II, check it out. It's a very important moment of Jewish resistance. 750 Jewish fighters held off the Nazis for 3 weeks. Irina's father was one of the leaders of the uprising, and he was killed by the Nazis. And Irina says, "I need to convince others of what I have to convince myself again and again, that our fears are real, rooted in history, but they can't stop us from making just choices. We must choose justice despite our fears." And that's how I got the subtitle of my book. So what about the hostages? Last week, my friend Alicia called to tell me that her friend Vivian Silver was one of the people taken hostage. Vivian is a 74-year-old peace activist who spent decades volunteering to help people in Gaza. Her kibbutz was burned to the ground, her friends murdered. Her son Yonatan said, "She must be mortified by the destruction in Gaza and vengeance." Vengeance is not a strategy. How many dead Palestinians will be enough for us to feel safe? It's just the wrong thing to do. Hamas has repeatedly offered to exchange all the hostages for all Palestinian prisoners, and former Israeli army generals and heads of the Israeli Secret Service support this. But the Israeli government has refused, saying that would be giving in to Hamas. Families of hostages and thousands of others are demonstrating across Israel, pressing the Netanyahu government to negotiate with Hamas to release the hostages through a ceasefire or through a prisoner exchange. I'm going to take a pause here, because that's a lot, and just ask you to take a few breaths together. You can close your eyes if you want. Just feel whatever's going on in your body. And I'm going to suggest that we take 4 breaths in and 8 breaths out. And let's do that 2 more times. 4 breaths in and 8 breaths out. And 4 breaths in and 8 breaths out. And just feel whatever's going on in your body at the time. And you can keep doing that. I also wanted you to know that Palestinians have a long history of nonviolent resistance. In May 2018, young Palestinians organized the Great March of Return, 30,000 to 40,000 Palestinians nonviolently marching weekly to the Gazan border. demanding the right to return to the homes they were expelled from in 1948. They were shot by Israeli snipers. 50 were murdered, 1,700 wounded. Children, women, journalists. They posed no harm to the Israeli military or civilians. In a recent interview, Israeli journalist Amira Haas said, Palestinians in Gaza who are under 30 years old, which I'm guessing is most of you here, have never seen a mountain in their lives. A mountain. They don't understand the concept of a spring of water coming out of a rock over a mountain because they've never been allowed to leave Gaza. And I was so moved by this powerful article in Middle East Eye about a Palestinian journalist, Omar, who wrote about crossing into Israel from Gaza after Hamas fighters tore down the gates. Omar was not a Hamas fighter, he was a journalist. He wrote that entering the land my family had been displaced from in 1948, I was overwhelmed with emotion. I felt joy and started crying. I was in a state of amazement as I walked around free in our lands, outside the prison that's Gaza. I've lived all my life under siege. This is the first time I felt freedom. So what does the US have to do with all this? Any of us who pay taxes in this country are complicit in the genocide of Gaza because the US sends $3.8 million in aid to Israel every year, and now millions more. 3.8 billion, I hope I said that. And most of that has to be spent in this country, and most of it goes to weapons manufacturers. So in effect, this US aid subsidizes the Pentagon. US State Department veteran Josh Paul just resigned last month from the State Department to protest the continued arms sales to Israel amidst its bombardment of Gaza. This is from Winona LaDuke, an Anishinaabe activist and leader of Honor the Earth. And Winona said, we, the US, can't talk about Israel because we can't talk about Wounded Knee, because we have Andrew Jackson on our $20 bill, because we are one huge settlement on stolen land. We can't talk about Israel because we are Israel. Thankfully, Cori Bush and 17 other House members have sent a ceasefire resolution to Congress calling for an unconditional ceasefire. If you are willing, I really urge you to call, email, text your representatives now. Tell them to sign on to this ceasefire resolution. Doesn't matter if they're super right-wing. Just raise your voice. This is something really important. 120 countries in the UN General Assembly voted for a ceasefire. The US vetoed it in the Security Council. Senator Dick Durbin is the first senator to call for a ceasefire in exchange for release of the hostages, and he's the second highest ranking senator. Secretary of State Blinken is finally urging a humanitarian pause. That's a good thing, but it's only a temporary cessation. I think it's 4 hours stopping for hostilities, and that's only in a few places. And then yesterday, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives censored the only Palestinian member of Congress, Rashida Tlaib, for her criticism of Israel and her call for Palestinian freedom and equality. She spoke beforehand, breaking down in tears at one point. She said, "The cries of the Palestinian and Israeli children sound no different to me. What I don't understand is why the cries of Palestinians sound different to you all." And as soon as I heard about the attacks on October 7th, I knew it was going to lead to a huge rise in anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism and anti-Semitism. When Biden spoke on October 10th, rather than calling for de-escalation, he repeated unverified Israeli allegations about things Hamas had done, which then whipped up anti-Palestinian hatred and the desire to shed Palestinian blood, both in Palestine and in the US. Israel has not provided any hard evidence to support these allegations. So I want to share with you now a few examples of the anti-Arab and anti-Muslim hate that's happening. The horrific murder of 6-year-old Palestinian American Wadia al-Fayoumeh on October 16th in Chicago. He was stabbed 26 times by his landlord. And the landlord also severely wounded Wadia's mother, Hanan Shaheen, age 32. While attacking Wadia, the killer reportedly yelled, "You Muslims must die. You're killing our kids in Israel. You Palestinians don't deserve to live." Illinois State Representative Abdel Nasser Rashid said, "This murder was directly connected to the dehumanizing of Palestinians by our media and our elected officials, who've lacked the moral compass and the courage to call for de-escalation and peace." The Council on American-Arab Relations, or CARE, had to move their annual banquet to a private location after the hotel where they were planning to meet received a series of bomb threats. A 20-year-old Palestinian American was hospitalized after a hit and run in Cleveland. The driver allegedly yelled, "Kill all Palestinians, long live Israel." And a similar hit and run incident happened on the Stanford campus, targeting an Arab American student. Before striking him, the driver reportedly made eye contact and yelled, "F you people," before driving off. Right-wing group Accuracy in Media drove a billboard truck through Harvard, Columbia, and the University of Pennsylvania campuses, showing the faces of students who signed a letter supporting Palestine, along with their personal information, smearing them as anti-Semites. One student wrote, "As a Muslim who had nothing to do with that statement, I feel very unsafe walking to my class and back." There have been over 1,300 cases of punitive action against Palestinian American students, faculty, and allies being suspended, being silenced, having events canceled, losing their jobs and job offers because of supporting Palestine. In terms of anti-Semitic incidents, in France, a young Jewish woman was stabbed by an attacker. A swastika was scrawled on her door. Thankfully, she's recovering. In Dagestan, Russia, hundreds of people stormed onto the tarmac at the airport as a flight from Israel arrived, reportedly yelling anti-Semitic slogans and forcing officers to shut the airport down. 2 synagogues were firebombed or burned in Tunisia and Berlin after the mass explosion at the Gaza hospital. In the US, a Las Vegas man threatened to kill Jewish Democratic Senator Jackie Rosen from Nevada, who's also a former synagogue president. The man vowed to finish what Hitler started. He threatened to exterminate the lawmaker, calling her subhuman. A woman in Indianapolis intentionally crashed her car into what she mistakenly thought was a Jewish organization. Thankfully, no one was injured. She reportedly told police she'd been watching the news and couldn't breathe anymore, and referenced her people back in Palestine. Students at Cornell University are shaken by threats posted on a site for fraternities and sororities. Posts said, "Jewish people need to be killed. Shoot up 104 West," which is the kosher dining hall. "If I see a pig Jew, I will stab you and slit your throat," and others too vile to mention. And there's ongoing physical assaults and hate speech happening against folks who are Arab, Muslim, and Jewish. And just to be clear, it's not anti-Semitic to criticize Israeli government policies. I'm just going to say it one more time. It's really important. It is not anti-Semitic to criticize Israeli government policies, just like it's not anti-American to criticize US policies. And the rage of so many Arab and Palestinian people at the Israeli government because of their genocide against Palestinians is completely understandable. I'm angry too, just as I'm heartsick. But to vent that rage at the Israeli state, but to vent that against Jewish people and institutions, as opposed to against symbols of the Israeli state, is anti-Semitism. Jewish people and the Israeli state are not one and the same goes with Islamophobia. This is a really important time to be in solidarity with Muslims, Arab folks, and Jews, to speak out against anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism and anti-Semitism. These all need to be fought in coalition together. Law students for justice in Palestine at UC Berkeley and Jewish Voice for Peace students at George Washington University wrote, "In order to dismantle anti-Semitism, we need to build safety through solidarity, to fight for all students' safety, including that Jewish organizers need to publicly resist efforts to silence the Palestinian freedom movement." Thankfully, meanwhile, support is growing for a ceasefire, transforming grief into action. Towards that end, according to a recent poll, 66% of Americans support a ceasefire. Thousands of high school and college students are walking out of schools at more than 100 campuses to call for a ceasefire. Thousands of Jewish activists have been sitting in at the Capitol Rotunda and the Statue of Liberty and Grand Central Station, blocking entrances to the White House, calling for a ceasefire, including dozens of rabbis. Nearly 900 of these Jewish activists have been arrested, chanting, "Not in my name, let Gaza live, never again for anyone." More than 400 Capitol Hill staffers, led by Muslims and Jews, circulated a letter urging their congressional bosses to back a ceasefire. Thousands of Palestinian Americans and allies marched across the Brooklyn Bridge, calling for an end to the occupation. 300,000 marched Saturday in Washington, D.C., and there have been so many interfaith protests, sit-ins, die-ins for ceasefires nationwide, tens of thousands protesting around the world. And 150 rabbis for ceasefire sent a powerful, heartfelt video calling for a ceasefire. Fadi Abu Shamala in Gaza wrote, "I'm so proud of the hundreds of thousands of Americans who went to demonstrate for us. Please keep going. Please keep doing what you're doing now. We are being killed by your tax dollars. Please say no to your administration." Meanwhile, on the ground in Israel, over 1,600 Israelis living in Israel or abroad have signed a petition calling for an immediate end of the attack on Gaza. And for those of you who don't know, most Israeli citizens are Jews, but 20% are Palestinian citizens of Israel, as opposed to the Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza under occupation. There's enormous repression going on from the Israel state. Hundreds of Palestinian citizens of Israel and some left-wing Jews are being suspended from studies, fired from jobs, often brutally arrested late at night, just because of showing solidarity with Palestinians on social media. Left-wing activists are receiving death threats. One said, "If you go out in the street and have a sign or a slogan against the war, you can die." At Netanya Academic College near Tel Aviv, hundreds of right-wingers chanted outside, "Death to the Arabs," tried to break into the student dorms, demanding that Arab students be expelled from the city. One student said, "I genuinely believed my life was in jeopardy." Meanwhile, there are Jewish defense teams of young Israelis patrolling the streets, trying to keep Palestinians from being attacked. Although Israeli anti-war groups are under threat, they do keep struggling and resisting, and they're accused of being traitors. The Israeli Feminist human rights group, Gun-Free Kitchen Tables, works to decrease gun ownership by private citizens and to stem violence. They're calling for a ceasefire, an exchange of hostages, an end to occupation. Israeli Against Apartheid are doing the same. And Standing Together is a courageous organization of Palestinian and Jewish citizens of Israel who envision a just and equal society that treats every person with dignity. This is from Jewish Israeli anti-occupation activist Sahar Vardi. It's that moment when you talk to an Israeli friend who doesn't know whether their relatives are dead or kidnapped, and to see the helplessness, the fear, the deep pain. And a moment later, it's talking to a friend from Gaza who can only say that every night is now the scariest night of her life, that she calculates her chances and those of her daughters of waking up alive in the morning. It's to hold everyone's humanity and it's hard. As if we don't understand that there's no solution only for the pain of one without a solution for the pain of the other. My white, feminist, queer Jewish mentor of blessed memory, Melanie K. Kantrowitz, said, "Solidarity is the political version of love." Ilhan Omar said, "The truth is that only solidarity and love will stop this war and stop more civilians from losing their lives." And my plea to those of you all who are students, these are incredibly intense and scary times. It's fine to argue, it's fine to disagree, but please don't threaten each other. Please keep each other safe. Violence accomplishes nothing. Our humanity is at stake. One Jewish organizer wrote, "If we want things to change, we must do what has never been done. This means committing to policies that guarantee safety, dignity, and freedom for Palestinians and Israelis." And I'm on the home stretch here. May we hold in one hand 75 years of occupation, dispossession, and violence, and in another 2,000 years of anti-Jewish violence and hatred, and in both a future of peace, justice, and freedom. Last week, Angela Davis said change is possible. She said the future does not have to replicate the past. And I just wanted to say it's okay to be heartbroken for more than one group of people at the same time. Let's keep our hearts open and hold on to our humanity. Let's call for ceasefire now, stop the genocide, release the hostages, end the occupation, and call for equality and fairness and safety and dignity for both peoples. And I'll close with these two short pieces. This was written by the youth wing of Jewish Voice for Peace. We are punks and students and parents and janitors and rabbis and freedom fighters. We remember brave, desperate resistance. We remember the labor movement. We remember the camps. We refuse to knowingly oppress others. We refuse to oppress each other. We will not carry the legacy of terror. We won't buy the logic that slaughter means safety. We commit to equality, solidarity, and integrity. We seek breathing room and dignity for all people. And I'll close with this. A while ago, MSNBC interviewed Palestinian legal scholar and activist and my colleague, Nora Erekat, about Palestine and Israel. And they asked Nora, as a Palestinian, what do you think should be done? What do you recommend? Nora replied, I recommend freedom. Thank you.